What's up, gamers? Welcome back to 180 MTG. My name is Ryan Overturf, and today I'm going to be talking about my Premodern Twobert. That is a 180 card cube featuring only cards printed before 8th edition. I do want to go ahead and get in front of this. This cube design is not consistent with pre-modern constructed rules. This is a cube designed around when I started playing Magic, which was back in 2003, so at the time Legions was the new set. Scourge was the first new set released after I started playing, and of course Scourge was the last set that to be standard legal to be released that would not go on to be legal in Modern. So for the purposes of this cube, it's very much for me a celebration of the game when I started playing, and I don't abide by the rules of the pre-modern constructed format. I allow things like alpha beta unlimited duels. I do think that those meaningfully contribute to consistent mana bases, so I like having them around in this cube. And then I also feature some of the oldest sets, Arabian Nights, Legends, which I think are cool as hell. I would not want to exclude those sets. And I have some Portal 3 Kingdoms, just everything that existed. So my rules for construction here was the card had to have existed in 2003. A lot of the cards I selected for this cube are certainly iconic for this era and time, and then I kind of just curated around the loudest, coolest cards to try to come up with a balanced and fun environment to play. And I do want to be clear that I think that is a real challenge when you use older cards like this. I think that, certainly from the perspective of Cube, Magic is a game where more sets are strictly additive. Having more cards as options means that you have more tools to design a better game. It's true that there are often new cards and new sets that I don't like, but there's always at least a little bit that I'm happy to sample from. But for the purpose of this cube, I do have an aesthetic direction where I do only use cards with that old card frame, and I'm not touching into stuff like the retro borders. I know a lot of people do the old card frame and then they'll use the new cards printed with the retro border. For this cube, I'm really trying to capture the experience of just starting to play Magic in the year 2003 and opening up boxes of cards that would have existed then. For me, I'm thinking of going through the boxes of like bulk rares at the local collectibles store, seeing whatever random cards they had in the display case, going to my friend's house and looking through his old bulk and his older brother's old cards and discovering things for the first time. This was also an era where, at least personally at home, I was still on dial-up internet when I was getting into Magic in 2003. So I couldn't just be online all the time and just learn all the cards very quickly because the internet used the same line as the phone line. You couldn't use the phone and the internet at the same time. Crazy, right? Zoomers are going to lose their mind hearing that. But I would discover cards really slowly. I'd be shopping for cards, looking at listings online and looking at the customers also bought this and learning about cards that way, cards that were related to the cards I was interested in, maybe poking around on Gatherer way before Scryfall existed. And I'm really just trying to highlight the range of what exists at the time. So while the cube does feature a lot of historically powerful cards, kind of the driving force, the motivation behind card selection here is I'm trying to show you the way that I discovered Magic. I'm trying to show you Magic through the eyes of young Ryan in 2003. So preamble out of the way, I'm going to get the Cube Cobra link in the show notes so you can follow along. Let's go ahead and break the cube down by color and see what makes my pre-modern Twobert tick. First up, as always, is white. White is the color where I really feel there is the least room to maneuver in this kind of environment with this kind of card restriction. When it comes to older white cards, so many of the cards are just so bad. And then when it comes to the way that they used to make the occasional strong white card, they just play so bad. I'm not going to reach for balance. I'm not going to reach for moat. These prison-y cards or like weird one-sided, you can't play the game style cards are going to be non-starters for me. And then one of my early intuitions was to try to have kind of a white weenie, kind of that antiquated name for mono white aggro decks, or just trying to have white be a little bit more of an aggressive color. And most of the 1 and 2 mana creatures that you can put into the cube, they're just awful. And while being awful, they also sometimes play awful. Like, you can put in White Knight or Silver Knight, those protection from black and red creatures, or like the cheap shadow creatures, so they can't block, but your opponent can't block them. And they're just trying to circumvent the idea of actually playing a game. Like, the idea similar to Moat, the protection cards are trying to just stop the game from actually happening, so they're not that fun, and in practice they just weren't that powerful. There was just not that much incentive to be a white aggressive deck. You were way more inclined to play a red aggressive deck because all the burn spells, they give you this reach so you can just more easily navigate the game that way. It was really difficult to be successful with a white aggressive deck, and the white aggressive cards simply were not appealing. You do have some standouts like Mother of Runes, and I definitely wanted to feature Mother of Runes because this was a big card for me on the kitchen table when I started playing Magic. And it's oppressively powerful. It shows up, if you don't answer it right away, it just makes it really difficult to engage with removal. You need something like a sweeper or some way to go way over the top of it. But it was just a card that I played against a lot when I first started playing Magic. And part of the reason I didn't see it as that messed up of a card back then, some of it is just that's what the game was. You know, I'm learning a new game. I will play by the rules of the game. Another aspect was we were playing a lot of goofy multiplayer games. It wouldn't be uncommon for us just to be playing 3 or 4 player free-for-all games. This was way before Commander, so typically it'd be like a 60 card deck, just cards that we owned battling against each other. When you have multiple opponents, Mother Runes gets a lot weaker. I certainly don't think Mother Runes is one of the absolute most powerful cards on the cube, and kind of not really leaning into white as an aggressive color does diminish its power some, but it still shows up in powerful ways. It's a really nice backup for your Exalted Angel, but you do have to work for a little bit. Even after trimming way back on aggressive white creatures, I did have to save a slot for Armageddon. And I will say, again, yes, the play patterns on Armageddon are rancid. There's just no way to get all the way away from that when you're playing with old cards like this. So I did want to give a pass to the most iconic ones. And one thing about Armageddon is when you cast it, the game is probably over. Like, it's so rare that you Armageddon and then it's just, oh, we're still playing on. Like, maybe you cast an Armageddon when neither player has anything going on. Doesn't really come up in practice. I kind of like that it's like a 0 or a 10. You know, typically, you're ahead and you cast it and you win, or you're behind and you can't cast it. Those are kind of the two states for Armageddon. And when you compare that to a card like Moat, where it's like, you cast it, and the game goes on forever in a way where it's not clear who's winning, but you've blanked some amount of your opponent's cards. You know, Armageddon is different than that. At least texturally, sometimes you do cast it and you do just win. And I think hitting an I win button can be kind of fun. I am way more averse to stuff that really drags the game on. There are some cards that promote longer games that I am sympathetic to. A card that's not in the cube that I have half a mind to pick up a copy of is Shahrazad. Totally nonsense card. You play a sub game for some stakes in your game. And the reason that I would want to include that one is it really highlights the way that the game started. It strongly highlights the history of the game, where some of the early designs are just total nonsense. And when you talk about Magic as Richard Garfield intended, I think a lot of people mistakenly use that phrase to describe really balanced and normal games, when the reality is Shahrazad is an essential piece of Magic as Richard Garfield intended. Some stuff that's just really whimsical and goofy and casting a spell you never seen before is certainly a huge part of the history of the game. So I may or may not track down a copy of that card for this cube. And then for what's actually here, a lot of white strength comes down to powerful removal spells, Swords of Plowshares, even really pacifism and arrest. They can be quite effective against the kind of creatures that show up in this environment. Wing Shards can be a really nice defensive tool that was freshly printed here. It's the one card with Storm. Can't use it to win the game, but sometimes it sure can end the game, or stop your opponent from winning, rather. Have a couple sweepers, Wrath of God, Rout. I also have Parallax Wave, just some nice ways to push back against a battlefield that gets out of hand for you. And then one of the more creative things that I'm doing with white is I center sort of a reanimation shell in both white and, of course, it's in black, but I push it a little bit more than you necessarily have to in white, just to give white a little bit more of an identity. An important aspect of Reanimator back then is that the creatures that you were cheating into play just weren't that powerful. Even if they were to end the game on their own, it takes a couple turns to really do it. We're not getting Gristlebrand, right? We're getting Akroma Angel of Wrath. It's just a big 6/6 flyer with haste and some other abilities. Takes a couple hits to actually close with that, even if the haste is quite strong. And so I think that Karmic Guide is just kind of a card that you would often see in environments like this for being a good value creature, but I push it a little bit further by also having Loyal Retainers reaching into Portal 3 Kingdoms for this 3-mana creature that can reanimate legendary creatures from your graveyard. So just letting white do a little bit more in that recursive space. It helps Akroma to feel a little bit more like a white card when the cards that reanimated are actually white. That's something that always feels a little color pie breaky, a little color balance screwy when you see a card in a column that just that color would never cast. You are actually putting Akroma into play for 8 mana sometimes in this cube, and it's also meaningful, I think, that you can cheat Akroma into play with white cards some amount of the time. Another aspect of that Reanimator package is just creatures with cycling, Eternal Dragon being the big one in white, and this is just a creature that you can play honestly, and it's quite strong. Plain cycling for 2 with the ability to get it back. I know when you read 5 mana to return it to your hand during your upkeep, 7 mana to cast, and it's just a 5/5 flyer, that is not much of a card by today's standards, but back then, and in this cube, you do just return it to your hand and just cast it a lot. This is actually a really meaningful way to beat counterspells. When we get the blue, you're going to see there's a ton of counterspells in this cube. This card is just strong, and then those reanimation synergies bump it up even to be a little bit more powerful. That's actually one of the most significant cards in white. I also have Jareth Leonin Titan here as a large white legend. This is part of a cycle. Every color has one of these creatures that costs 3 generic mana plus 3 of their respective colored pips. Jareth is just a large creature, 4/7, can gain protection, gets larger when it's blocking. A pretty nice one to get back with your Loyal Retainers, with your Karmic Guide if you have some discard outlet. And then, of course, Arcanus the Omnipotent, Visara the Dreadful, Rorik's Bladewing, and Silvos Rogue Elemental. These just being some of the meatiest creatures that existed at the time. And even at triple colored mana, they're reasonably castable. It's certainly going to happen more often if you put Jareth in your deck that you can cast Jareth than you could cast Akroma. 6 is just that much less than 8. And I'm happy having another castable legend that is still strong to reanimate as well. Something that I'm long on in white in this cube is an aspect of the game that is really not present today, and that's cards that incentivize you to miss land drops. And when that becomes part of the game, actually kind of both players are incentivized to miss land drops. That's going to be Tithe, Weathered Wayfarer, and Land Tax, where there's this game where the white player with access to these cards can gain some advantage if they fall behind on lands on the battlefield. And it is so often correct when your opponent plays land tax that you're just not supposed to ever get a land out ahead of them because they functionally, they draw 3 cards getting the basics. And it's a really weird play pattern, and it's like not a fun thing to do. The only reason that you can consider that fun is you have some nostalgia for it, or because you like the chase of the power that's offered there. I mean, land tax is really powerful when it goes off. But the alternative is, I'm not going to put in crappy White Knights, I'm not going to put in moats. So this is something that at least there's like an interesting game happening, and I'm really squeezing blood from a stone in white. And in this stuff, I really do enjoy the gameplay of Weathered Wayfarer and missing land drops. And if your opponent plays along, you attack for 1, and that can be really silly and kind of fun. And then like Tithe does at least always just work, and it can find dual lands to fix your mana. So I'm not leaning super hard into this, even though I have 3 cards. And I am also saying this is not something... It is good that this is not part of Magic anymore. But if I'm building a cube about how Magic used to be, then this is a part of how Magic used to be. And the last thing that I want to touch on in white is the Morph package I have going on in the cube. You can't not include Exalted Angel in this kind of pre-modern environment. It's a card that saw a lot of constructed play at the time. sees a lot of constructed play in pre-modern today, and it's mostly a card that you just play on rate, but I did want to add some more morphs so that when your opponent plays a face-down creature, it's not just always Exalted Angel, so there could be a little bit of a game to that. I didn't want to go super overboard because that is really a homeworky mechanic, right? You do have to know what the morphs are to meaningfully engage with the game. So I have a good sampling. I have 7 morphs. There's 2 in white. The other white morph is Whipcorder, a card that used to see actually quite a lot of cube play once upon a time. It's just solid to play face up as a 2/2 tapper for 2. And importantly, when it comes to morph in this cube, 3 mana 2/2 just used to be a very reasonable body to put in your limited deck. And the power level of this cube, there's some really strong cards here, but when it comes to creatures, 3 mana 2/2 is still just a reasonable body here. So part of what Whipcorder does is it obfuscates whether your face down card is Exalted Angel or not, and then it is just pretty strong. Face up or face down, it's just fine to include in your deck. And then I have a couple more morphs in red, a couple in green, and then the Zombie Cutthroat, which is the one that's the gotcha in the spread. The Zombie Cutthroat, of course, being a 3/4. You basically always play face down and you morph it up for 5 life. So that one can make combat kind of goofy with these. So it did lean a little bit into the homeworky aspect of morph, but for the most part, there's just a couple that you have to know, and it does make sort of a game where you have some information to consider when you're reading your opponent when they play a morph on turn 3. Is it their Exalted Angel? Is it Whipcorder? Is it the Zombie Cutthroat? And it can be kind of fun to engage with that once you get past learning the few cards with morph in the cube. And that brings us to blue. Blue, of course, the most powerful color in the cube. I think Fact or Fiction makes a really strong argument for being the strongest card in the cube. When you're playing with cards from this era of Magic, card advantage does just bury you. So Fact or Fiction being so many looks towards your best cards, and often just being a 3-for-1, it so often puts you very far ahead, and it's very splashable. There's a lot of counter spells here. An important piece of the Ryan Overturf lore is when I first started playing Magic, I just bought a deck from my friend Joe for $10. It was just a mono blue deck, a stack of islands, a lot of counter spells, and some mopey creatures. The creatures in this cube are quite a lot better than the creatures that I started playing Magic with, but the counter spells are just the same. I did have 4 copies of just counterspell proper in that deck. Forbid is a card that was in that deck. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that Forbid is like this super fun card to play against. It isn't. If you've never played with it before, you might think that discarding 2 cards for the buyback is a real cost. It's not. You'll end up with some lands or whatever you want to discard. There's some ways around it with Deep Analysis, Squeed, Goblin, and Bob. I don't need to push Forbid as hard as I do. It is beatable. There's stuff like Eternal Dragon that's good against counterspells. There's stuff like Creature Lands. There's ways where you can beat an opponent that is buying back Forbid, but it is one of the most powerful cards in the cube, and it's not the most fun thing to slog through. It's just literally a part of my welcome to Magic all those years ago. I did make a point to have drawbacks on a number of the other cards in the blue column. One thing that I explicitly avoided, you won't see Control Magic, you certainly won't see Treachery. I didn't want to give the blue decks those really easy ways to completely invalidate what their opponent was doing and win the game. You have these strong counterspells, so you can push back against a lot of really strong stuff and be a little bit agnostic about your opponent's game plan in that way, but I didn't want to give you those really easy tools to actually close the game. Instead, you still do need to lean a little bit on creatures. Serendib Efreet is a really good rate, but it does have a drawback. You do find yourself in racing situations with the Efreet damaging you every turn. Stuff like Vesuvan Doppelganger is sweet and it's powerful, but it costs 5. You have to tap out at sorcery speed for that. I do have Old Man of the Sea. It's sort of the avatar of this cube. A maybe not subtle nod to the fact that this is a reference to learning to play the game over 20 years ago. It's a card that I kind of always wanted to own. And it doesn't gain control of that many creatures in the cube. It's something that I think about. It hasn't actually happened in games, but it's kind of funny. pretty often you would want to modify Old Band of the Sea's power, and really the only way to do that is with Rancor, to actually try to gain control of bigger things with it. A lot of what justifies Old Band of the Sea being here is that I don't want to just have all of the most powerful blue cards, and also 2-3 is just a pretty reasonable body, similar to what I was saying about Morph. And I will say that while I did not go with the most powerful cards to gain control of opponents' creatures, I do still have some stuff that's pretty punishing here for the creature cheat decks. It's pretty tough to have your Achroma Mana Ward. It's pretty tough to want to engage with that kind of game when your opponent controls Waterfront Bouncer. Capsize, also a really powerful tool there. And again, Capsize, buyback, not the most fun thing going on. But there are aggressive tools largely focused in red and green that you can beat up the blue decks in proactive ways. I just want to highlight by bringing up these things that there is a metagame going on, and it's kind of inescapable that some of this stuff is not the peak of the most fun possible Magic gameplay, but it is all designed in a way where there is an infrastructure where you can engage with a lot of different archetypes. Blue is the strongest color, but you don't just have to play blue to be successful. My favorite slots in blue actually end up being cards that do have a little bit of downside. I love having Psionic Blast here. I mean, it is a removal spell in blue. Blue doesn't really get that. That color pie break is really powerful, but dealing 2 damage to you, it is a real cost, and the blue deck is trying to maintain its life total. It's pretty bad at playing on the battlefield, so I think that Psionic Blast, despite being powerful, is pretty charming in that way. And then some of the other draw spells in blue, they're cards that you can't just put in a deck. They're powerful when you explore some synergies or play them in a certain way, but cards like Careful Study, Frantic Search, and Gush, they can be really punishing if you just cast them. I do like that it takes a little bit of cleverness to play this properly. You can't just put Frantic Search in your blue-white control deck, because to the extent that card advantage can just win games by having more cards than your opponent, that card disadvantage is also really punishing. If you're not putting something into the graveyard meaningfully to recur it, if you're not getting back Squee Goblin to Bob with these, or if you're doing this to try to hit land drops, you're gonna find yourself in trouble. And that's very true with Gush, where more often than not, you're just supposed to cast Gush for 5 mana at instant speed. I think that there's a lot of times where maybe you're missing a land drop and you think, oh, I should just Gush here, but then you end up with 2 lands back in your hand, you draw 2 cards, you of course get to make your land drop, you get to play that island again, one of the islands that you picked up, but now you have to discard a hand size, and maybe you don't have a spell that you can actually proactively play. Certainly if you're sitting on these counter spells, that's a lot of what's going on in blue, right? So there's a real cost to returning the islands to your hand. There's a real cost to playing these looting effects without anything that inherently synergizes with them. So I have a lot of really powerful cards in blue, but then I also have some cards in blue that cause you to need to work a little bit harder. So it's not as easy as just putting all the blue cards in the deck. I do force blue players to work a little bit harder here, and there are just some generically strong cards. I'm not just punishing blue outright. It actually takes a very heavy hand to try to make blue weak at all using recognizable cards from this era, so I'm not going that hard, but I do have it set up where if you just shuffle up the 23 blue cards, you are going to struggle a little bit against the other mono colors. There's some give and take here. I'm not just loading all the power in blue, I'm not fully shying away from it being the best color, but I do make you jump through at least a couple hoops. Next up is black. Black actually has a lot in common with white in this cube. You have a number of value creatures. You're also doing that cycling creature reanimator thing. Scion of Darkness and Twisted Abomination being the 2 nice black cyclers. And you have Entomb, so black can just lean harder into being a graveyard recursive deck. The other huge tool on that front is Recurring Nightmare. Recurring Nightmare is easily the standout card in black. It's the kind of card where once you get it going, typically all you're doing every turn is spending all of your mana casting Recurring Nightmare as many times as you can and grinding out advantages that way. It's a card that's a bit offensive to modern sensibilities with how it really just makes the game about one thing, but I can't deny that it's fun to cast. So while we're going down this path of playing with these old cards that can sometimes be a little bit repetitive and miserable, I at least see the charm in it in some way, and I do enjoy drafting Recurring Nightmare myself. You have a couple other nice value cards, Hypnotic Spectre, Phyrexian Arena, just kind of grinding out value turn over turn, some nice removal spells, Duress and Hymn to Turok being good ways to push back against the counter spells in blue, Mesmeric Fiend also doing some good work in that department. I'm really happy to give Braid's Cabal Minion a home here. That's a card that used to be really strong, used to show up in a lot of cubes, fell off in a big way. It is just a 4-mana 2/2. It's really easy to interact with. But something that it highlights about old Magic here that I wanted to have represented is that your lands aren't safe in this environment. There's going to be some stuff that happens in games, similar to Armageddon, where your lands are going to get blowed up. The synergies that push Braids way over, there's not a ton of that going on in the cube. I'm not really trying to make it so Braids has this easy deck you can build around it. But just casting Braids for 4, your opponent does have to sacrifice their permanent first. So kind of the idea with Braids is you can just proactively get it out. It's one of the cards that does incentivize being on the play. And if you just cast Braids on time, your opponent is going to have to do something about it or just lose all of their lands. While you probably have a good plan, you've probably built your deck around Braids, at least in the sense that you have a lean mana curve that can exploit a card like this. I do think Braids also does a good job of highlighting the way that this cube is about exploring Magic and being new to the game. This isn't an era where you had a lot of stuff like Bloodghast. There's some cards that I could have included that come back from the graveyard, but instead, I want you to look at some cards and ask yourself, okay, what am I supposed to do with this? And I'm not saying that Braids is weak or anything like that. It's just interesting that there's not an obvious answer. There's not a clear thing to do with the card. So it's interesting to see how other players engage with this ability. How do I make this ability that can be kind of a drawback and leverage this symmetrical effect where it's more punishing for my opponent? And it's kind of fun to explore these things where there's no extreme to push it to. It's just a card that can be good depending on how you finesse it and seeing how other people approach finessing it. And then the elephant in the room with black is going to be the presence of Vampiric and Demonic Tutor. These offer a lot of redundancy. I've gone over some cards that do really headline decks, cards like Recurring Nightmare, where having higher access to them do just make your deck that much stronger. But I do want you to be able to access your strongest cards. There's just not that much card filtering and card selection in this era of Magic, certainly outside of blue. This is before the scry mechanic even existed, so you're just mostly drawing one card every turn. So giving you higher access to your desired cards, I think that is just net fun in the environment. If there were a card that I felt was really over the line and every time it shows up and every time it's drawn it just wins the game, I would be more inclined to cut that card than the Tutor. Recurring Nightmare is really strong, but it's not like Recurring Nightmare is just won every match. It's not like the Recurring Nightmare deck shows up every draft and you tutor for it and you win very easily. It's a deck that has moving parts, it's a deck that requires setup, and kind of everything in this cube has moving parts and requires setup. And something that if you haven't spent a lot of time playing Demonic Tutor in lower power environments that might surprise you, is that you tutor for a land kind of a weird amount of the time. It's because of that lack of card selection. Like, it's not that uncommon that you just need to do something to make your deck function. If there were a really broken deck, sure, I wouldn't allow you to have Demonic Tutor for Entomb and Reanimate if you were putting Gristlebrand onto the battlefield. But you're not putting Gristlebrand on the battlefield. You're putting a Chroma on the battlefield. You're putting Verdant Force on the battlefield. And then it's like dying to Snuff Out or getting Mana Ward. So allowing you to be a little bit more consistent when this environment is so long in interaction, I think that is just good. I think it's just net fun. So I'm pretty firm on liking the tutors in this cube. And that brings us to red. Red deals damage, and red destroys lands. In some ways, it's not that simple. In other ways, it is. That's red for you. Land destruction in red was kind of a fun thing to approach for me, because at first I definitely wanted to make sure that some land destruction was present, but then I had to figure out, okay, which land destruction spells are actually making decks, which of this is too powerful, which is too weak. I was kind of wary about Dwarven Blast Miner. It's a 2-mana 1/1 with Morph, and you can pay 3 and tap it to destroy a non-basic land. Being a repeatable source of land destruction was a bit concerning. I was a little bit worried that this one would take over too many games. But in practice, it's pretty inefficient and it's very fragile. I've never actually destroyed more than 2 lands with Dwarven Blast Miner in a game, and notably that's a game that I lost. So I have decided that I like having Dwarven Blast Miner around, and largely because it is also part of that morph package that can make the shell game more fun there. I did at one point have Stone Rain in the cube. That one tended to just go last too often. The thing about Stone Rain is it's just a terrible top deck. If I have Dwarven Blast Miner going, and I destroy multiple lands, and I can still lose, that's emblematic of the issues with Stone Rain. You just have to have these effects on time, and you can go really long on them so that it's just more consistent, where you'll have them on turn 3, but then it just becomes really prescriptive and parasitic, where, okay, there's a Stone Rain deck, who's drafting the Stone Rain deck, and if it's nobody, there's all these land destruction spells going last. So I'd removed Stone Rain after trying it for a bit, and for a while I had Pillage out of the cube. I ended up reintroducing Pillage when I added Nevinyrral's Disc, because now there's a decent clip of artifacts that you would want to destroy with Pillage. I do like having that gameplay where you can pillage the disc before it comes online, and Icy Manipulator is one of the really nice interactive spells in the cube. So there's more play to that one, and that's kind of where my biases lie. Avalanche Riders gets a pass because it's a creature, and Avalanche Riders, this one actually can be really strong in the creature recursion decks, certainly with Recurring Nightmare, but even just with Karmic Guide, Avalanche Riders is really strong. I've actually had more success locking my opponent out with Avalanche Riders and Dwarven Blast Miner, and I think that a lot of that actually has to do with the 2/2 haste body. Like, Avalanche Riders is actually accelerating you towards ending the game. 2/2 is pretty modest, but it does deal damage. I think that the mana curve here in red is also pretty notable. We're similar to not just wanting there to be this Panza all land destruction deck because of the ways that the draft kind of crumbles if nobody's in that lane. I didn't go super hard on there being a mono-red aggressive deck. Yes, there's a lot of cards that are really good at dealing damage. They're more likely to show up in aggressive decks than controlling decks, but there's maneuverability. Grim Lavamancer is just as good in a control deck as it is in an aggro deck. Mog Fanatic is more of an aggressive card, but it is interactive. Even if you aren't main decking it in a control deck, you're going to side it in if your opponent has the 1-mana green creatures in this cube. The answer to Birds of Paradise is certainly valuable. Jackal Pup is specifically the all-gas, no-breaks, mono-red aggro 1-drop, but I only feature 1 because I want you to be able to explore that space. I want you to be aggressive sometimes when you're so inclined, but I didn't put in cards like Goblin Cadets or a bunch of other red creatures with drawbacks for very much the same reason that I don't have the white knights and the silver knights and the white shadow creatures. And I didn't mention it in black, but I also don't have the cheap black creatures that just attack and block because those colors just aren't doing that. The aggressive decks just aren't that strong. The tools that make those decks strong aren't the cheap creatures. It's kind of the stuff on the mana curve that actually forms a game plan that's hinging around something more powerful. You know, in white is Armageddon, and in black it's Recurring Nightmare and having interactive spells. In red, you have all these big damage dealers, so it's good to have Jackal Pup at the bottom of the curve, but it's way more important to have your Sulfuric Vortex when you get up to 3, and some reasonable stuff that can deal big damage. Siege Gang Commander is going to be more meaningful in a cube than having a bunch of 2/2s and 2/1s with downside. Of course, have Flametongue Kavu, an iconic card from this era of Magic. And I also have Fire Imp, kind of a more obscure pull from Portal. I expect not too many players have heard of this one. Fire Imp is a 3-mana 2/1 that when it enters deals 2 damage to any creature. Kills morphs cleanly, kills a lot of the creatures in this cube. There's just a lot of small stuff for it to answer. And this is also the kind of card that's more meaningful to have in your red deck than just having some creatures that attack and maybe can't even block. a value creature is going to go a lot longer way. And that's part of why Flame Tongue Kavu is such an important card for red, right? Giving red a 2-for-1 instead of forcing you to get there with kind of nuts and bolts, crappy creatures. I definitely like what Fire Imp adds to red. And then I have some kind of fun stuff. Hammer of Begarden is a nice card for burn decks. It's one of those ways that, albeit a pretty mana-intensive one, can slog through counterspells and can close games. You're able to get some chip shots in. Of course, the flashback on Firebolt can be helpful in that regard. And then the last note that I have on red is that I don't have any red sweepers in this cube. I think that that's something that you would see a lot of in cubes with this kind of restriction. Pyroclasm is definitely one of the standout cards on power level from this era. But I don't really like having 2 mana sweepers. It's just really punishing, and it punishes stuff. I've been saying how the cheap creatures are already kind of weak in this environment. I don't think you need to be super hostile to that kind of thing. And there are tools like Fire Ice in the cube that can still be pretty punishing to those decks, but I would rather the card just be generally more appealing, generally more playable, and less of like a metagame breaker kind of thing. I have had the card Earthquake in and out of the cube. That one I like because it damages players, but there's already a fair amount of burn that can just go upstairs. It's not super fun when your deck is just all burn spells and you're just trying to go upstairs and it's the only thing that you're doing. I like having a little bit more in the creature space, having to actually navigate combat. That way you're engaging with your opponent a little bit more. And I've never had anything like Wildfire or Burning of Xinyi. I think that kind of stuff just doesn't play with these other red cards. Like, you could add more infrastructure for that kind of thing, but then you have this deck that's just really focused around this card that, like I was saying with black, you don't really have card selection, so sometimes it goes off in a big way. Other times your draws are just really awkward. I strongly prefer the red column just being more focused. Just in general, I like curating these 180 card cubes so colors do a specific thing, and so having red skew largely more aggressive, it's just a nice quality of life thing. You have some room to maneuver, but there's not these cards that largely don't play well with each other within one color. When you only have 23 cards of a color, that kind of cohesion, it's pretty important for replayability. I know that there's an argument for decks being able to do different things and a color having a range of different expressions being more replayable because there's more different stuff going on, but with this small of an environment that actually hinders just general playability enough that it's not really going to extend replayability. You have to present something that's just playable every time before you can consider replaying it. Moving on to green. In green, you're going to see a number of the usual suspects. You're going to have mana-generating creatures, of course, Birds of Paradise, Llanowar Elves, and then big payoffs for your mana. I know Ravenous Baloth doesn't look like much by today's standards, and it certainly got weaker when they took damage off the stack. I don't play this cube with any special rules. I play the cube just with the rules as they exist today. So this is a 4-mana 4/4. You can sack it to gain 4 life. It's not that strong, but hey, 4 is a pretty big number in this context. It also pairs nicely with Genesis. Genesis is a card that I know when I started playing EDH or Commander, Genesis was pretty significant, but I started playing that before they had the Commander-specific precons, so I would believe this card doesn't get a lot of chatter in Commander anymore, but when you're looking at old border cubes, Genesis is a great source of turn-over-turn value. Also importantly, Eternal Witness didn't exist at this time, so Genesis is going to be one of your better cards for recursion, and then the turn-over-turn value is one of your better tools against counterspells. If you can get Genesis into your graveyard, it's actually really difficult for a control deck to grind through that. The control player actually has to start looking at winning the game when you're getting extra cards every turn. On rate, the card doesn't look like much anymore, but I assure you this card is very powerful in this cube. Part of that is that Genesis is part of a Survival of the Fittest package. Survival of the Fittest is a card that is, of course, banned in Legacy. Really powerful tutor effect, 2-mana enchantment. You can pay a green, discard a creature card, and search your library for any creature card, put it into your hand. Survival is just filthy. It's really busted with Recurring Nightmare. I added a number of the cards to the cube to specifically play well with it. I would probably have Genesis one way or the other, but then I have some Madness stuff, Basking Ruwala, just to fit into your survival package. A card that I'm really happy with is Arrogant Worm, just this giant Madness thing. The reason that I'm happy with this is that I added it specifically to just go into survival decks, but then the first draft after I added it, somebody was just playing it in a deck, like I had the survival, and somebody else just drafted the Arrogant Worm and was just playing it as a 5-mana 4/4, and they maybe could discard it sometimes. And just the fact that the 4/4 was playable, like you just cast this card for 5 and it's fine sometimes, similar to how Ravenous Baloth is just like a pretty big creature, that was very satisfying. Adding cards for a specific function to supplement a specific strategy and then just having them show up in other decks, that is a really good sign for your design. Just cards being broadly playable, that's going to increase replayability for sure. Every time that I have Survival of the Fittest in my deck in this cube, it feels like it's convincingly the strongest card in my deck. But then you also have problems where it's only strong when you draw it. And like I was saying, there's just not that much card selection in this cube. When you have Survival, it makes sense to go out of your way to splash black for those tutors. And of course, Recurring Nightmare plays very well with Survival of the Fittest, but it's just not a given. It doesn't just show up and dominate every draft. Even when I have it, and when I have really strong Survival of the Fittest packages, there's still just games where I have to play normal games. Like I don't have Survival of the Fittest early in the game. I have Basking Ruwala in my opening hand. And it's not like casting Basking Ruwala is terrible in this cube. It's pretty good at attacking, but it's clearly not my goal with that card. So the games end up kind of weird sometimes, and that's really fun. I think that if Survival did just show up and was busted every time, and it was really easy to have high access to it, I would be much colder on the card in the cube. But the way it's played out, the Survival decks just look really different from game to game, and that makes it a lot more fun. I'm pretty happy having this card in the environment, even though I did expect that it might be too powerful to hang around. Natural Order is kind of a funny one. Similar to the reanimation packages in this cube, you have this really cheap way to potentially cheat a giant creature into play. Verdant Force being the hallmark one there. I have some other nice ones in the gold column. But then your Natural Order, it can be undone by stuff like Manowar, Capsize, Terror. It's certainly a standout in terms of historical power, but a lot of that is when you start adding the new cards, the Craterhoof Behemoths you can go and tutor for. It actually ends up playing fairly modestly here, and it's so weak to a counterspell too, because the sacrifice is an additional cost. So you don't even always start the Natural Order. I think it's kind of fun to have it around, because sometimes it's really good, or there's the promise of games where it could just completely take over, but then in practice it is not as strong as it might appear. Truthfully, a lot of green's strength in this cube is just that the creatures in green attack really well. Wild Mongrel might not look like much, but its discard ability is useful in both dodging red removal and changing color to dodge some of the black removal. If you make your Wild Mongrel black, it can't die to Snuff Out anymore, and that's real, that comes up. Call of the Herd is really strong, partly because 3-mana 3/3 is just above rate relative to a lot of the other creatures in the cube, and then the Flashback makes it strong against 1-for-1 removal, makes it strong against counterspells, so that card very much punches above its weight class. Green also gets some nice value creatures like Wall of Blossoms, you have a Maya Elder, Deranged Hermit. You have Krosan Tusker as a cycling creature in green that you can use for those reanimation cards in white and black, while also being a good mana fixer and a cool 2-for-1. And then I do also want to highlight Plowunder. Plowunder is significant. If you're not familiar with the card, it's a 5-mana sorcery. Put 2 target lands on top of their owner's library. It can be pretty miserable to just know your draw step. When you're behind in the battlefield, when you're trying to draw your 1 card every turn to get out of it. This is the same reason I don't have Memory Lapse in the cube. I'm more sympathetic to that kind of thing in green because blue already has so much power. But I want to be clear that Plowunder is one of the stronger cards in the cube. I actually think that pound for pound, it's a stronger card than Armageddon. The fact that you can really only cast Armageddon when you're winning, whereas you can just cast Plowunder when you have 5 mana, and your opponent spending 2 turns just drawing lands probably is going to improve your position over time if it's not already just a home run when you cast it. So there's very valid reasons to be skeptical of Plowunder, but it's also an important part of the game's history. When I think about discovering the game and getting into Magic back in 2003, the cards you first get excited about, you see these giant creatures. You're like, whoa, Verdant Force. Whoa, I can cheat that into play with Natural Order. And then the card that is just backbreakingly powerful is just like this sorcery that references farming. You're like, what the heck is going on here? But that's just kind of what Magic was, and it can be kind of fun to discover that. And Plowunder is just a card that used to be in a lot of cubes. It used to actually be really strong even in Vintage Cube, and it's just antiquated. It just can't really hang anymore. The game happens way more on the battlefield, and Plowunder, it just is at home with the kind of Magic that was being played back then. And so it's very much at home as a tribute to that time in the game's history in this cube. And then the last thing I want to touch on in green is that I do not have Gaia's Cradle in this cube. Gaia's Cradle is legal in pre-modern, and there are reasons to be sympathetic to it. It generates a filthy amount of mana, the card is fundamentally broken, but it is reliant to you playing onto the battlefield. In general, things you're doing with Gaia's Cradle are going to be vulnerable to Wrath of God. I do have those multiple sweepers in the cube. There are ways to destroy lands in the cube. It's the kind of thing where I might pick one up at some time. I don't think it necessarily leads to anything good. I think that Gaia's Cradle probably pushes Plowunder into really unfun territory. At the same time, it might increase the stock of Natural Order in a meaningful way. So I could go either way on that one. I see the argument both ways. Currently, I'm anti-Gaia's Cradle because it is just so broken, but it is fun enough that I could see reversing course on that. For gold cards, I'm a little light relative to how much I usually like to have in these 180 card environments. Often I like to have 3 cards of any 2-color pair. Here I just have 2. There's 1 or 2 sweet or iconic cards in most of the color pairs. So you see that represented: Mirari's Wake, Vindicate, Pernicious Deed, Mystic Snake. These cards are all awesome. They're all here. The well does dry up pretty quickly, so I wasn't going to stretch to get too much more than that. There's also not a single Boros card that I like from this era. I mean, I like Goblin Legionnaire. It's just not strong enough. It doesn't really make decks. It's just going to go last too often. Another card that got a lot worse when they took damage off the stack. I'm not going to stress it. I'm not going to make myself put a Boros card in the cube. And then the gold card that really warms my heart, that I'm so happy to have here, is of course Sliver Queen. Sliver Queen is a card that I just really remember the mythos of when I started playing Magic. I was into Pokemon TCG when that was new, and one thing about Pokemon TCG is the card Charizard was always really sought after, always really rare, but it was never strong. It just had big numbers. It was cool, it was a starter from the game, so it was expensive, like you definitely couldn't afford it if you were a kid, but then even if you had it, it's just not even strong. And Sliver Queen really is the Charizard of Magic, or certainly for the time, Sliver Queen was the Charizard of Magic, where I had this awareness of this card, Sliver Queen, and it's a 5-mana 7/7, and they're big numbers. Wooburg mana is kind of hard to come by, the ability is not that strong. A couple of my casual friends, they had Sliver decks, and they always really wanted a Sliver Queen. Even if you're playing a Sliver deck, like the Sliver Queen is not that significant. Like, as an individual pound-for-pound card, there's some appealing things going on here. It's black, so it can't be targeted by the black removal spells that kill non-black creatures. It has 7 toughness, so it's pretty good against red damage. It makes creature tokens, so it's kind of an army in a can that way. But it is way more cool than powerful. This is a card you can find with Natural Order. It's one that is reasonable to entomb and reanimate. But more than it being there because it's so strong, and of course you have to feature Sliver Queen, it's more emblematic of the fact that Reanimator targets in that day were just not that good. They weren't immediate game enders. I love having Sliver Queen here. Sliver Queen is part of the reason why I like having ABU dual lands. There is some potential to actually cast Sliver Queen for mana, but it's mostly here because young Ryan thought Sliver Queen was awesome. I still feel that way, and I love having that card here. A number of the slots that I would usually use for gold cards end up in the colorless column here. There's a good spread of appealing and iconic cards here. Cursed Scroll, an absolute staple of old red aggressive decks. Grim Monolith. Admittedly, Grim Monolith here is a lot worse than in environments that give you a lot of extra card draw, but it still can show up in powerful ways. My favorite application of Grim Monolith here is that on turn 2, you play Grim Monolith. Turn 3, if you have 3 lands that produce the same color, you could cast one of those Pit Fighters, your Sylva's Rogue Elemental, your Rorik's Bladewing. I think that that's very cool. Icy Manipulator, Nevinyrral's Disc, Juggernaut, Masticore. These cards are all iconic. They really speak for themselves. And then kind of a funny one, I have Mox Diamond here. Similar to Grim Monolith, Mox Diamond gets worse at lower power levels. It does play really well with that stuff in a white that incentivizes missing land drops, that land tax, tithe kind of package. It's also nice to power out an Armageddon and being a mana source that sticks around if you do Armageddon. But it's pretty common in drafts in this environment for Mox Diamond to just go last. I don't have any Wheel of Fortune, Time Twister, or anything like that, and the games tend to go along. This is actually an environment where I have enough stuff going on where you can get run over, and there are positional advantages to getting your mana online before your opponent, but there's reason to think about taking the draw. Like, the extra card is pretty valuable, so discarding a card for a mana source, that is a real cost. And for the few real card advantage spells that I have, like, yeah, if you Mox Diamond, you can Factor Fiction a turn ahead of schedule. But what I was saying about maybe taking the draw is, like, you just have time. Casting it a turn later is not that big of a deal. And remember what I was saying about the creature cheat decks is, yeah, your opponent could, like, put an Necroma on the battlefield, but you'll have a couple turns to figure it out. Like, the game is not just over. So it is kind of funny the way that Mox Diamond is just not nearly as powerful as you would necessarily think. It's one of the most categorically powerful cards in the cube, but contextually it is actually weak in a lot of decks and games. The funniest artifact I have here is probably Chimeric Idol. It's one that maybe looks a little bit weird, one that a lot of people have probably never heard of because it's from Prophecy. It's a 3-mana artifact, and all it does is as an ability where you tap all your lands, and Chimeric Idol becomes a 3/3 artifact creature until end of turn. So the idea behind this card is that it's an aggressive creature, and you can play it color agnostic. You can put it in your green deck, your red deck, your white deck, whatever. And then it's a little bit more resilient against sweepers. Tapping all your lands is not really that much of a cost. There's only so much stuff going on at instant speed. There's a number of haste things that you want to be casting here. And then it insulates you a little bit against a sweeper. You're not committing as hard into Wrath of God if Chimeric Idol is your 3-drop. So this card is fine. I could go either way on it. I find it pretty charming. A friend of mine had this in a cube that has a very similar design conceit here, very similar card pool it was pulling from, and it always played very well in his cube, and I like it well enough here too. And then lastly, we have lands. As I mentioned at the top of the show, I have ABU duels here, I have Pain lands, and then I have the Onslaught fetch lands. You only have allied colored fetch lands. Even with just having 5 fetch lands, this is a 180 card cube. Generally, you're going to be playing with 2 or 4 players, so you're pretty likely to end up with fetch lands and fetchable duels that you're looking for. So even though it's not a full cycle, it's still quite powerful. Fetch lands also just really work as an incomplete cycle. The ones that are whatever your main color is are going to be really powerful, and you don't need like a million of them, especially when you only have 1 fetchable duel for any color pair. I don't think anybody really needs to be sold on fetch lands and fetchable duels, but just to highlight kind of what they can do in this environment, a recent draft that I drafted a mostly green deck. I ended up with Wooded Foothills and Windswept Heath. I was able to pick up Bayou, Taiga, and Tropical Island. And in my deck, I was splashing Factor Fiction off of Tropical Island. I was splashing Demonic Tutor off of the Bayou. The Demonic Tutor was useful because I was a Survival of the Fittest deck, and then the Taiga was largely because I had Anger in my deck. Anger being another card that was added largely to play with Survival of the Fittest. It's like okay to cast, 4 mana 2/2 haste, like it does some damage here, that's part of what's appealing about Avalanche Riders, and there's some upside, but just being able to splash it in that way to give everything haste in this survival of the fittest deck, it's really powerful. And just with 2 fetch lands and all those duels, you kind of have your first 3 sources for any of your splashes there on the house. It doesn't make it so that you can play a deck where you're totally color agnostic, you can play whatever you want. I just have all those single pipped or like easily splashable cards coming in there. So the mana bases are strong. They let you mess around a little bit with what you're doing. You can definitely explore and play with color, but it's not totally free to just play whatever color you want in this cube. I have a couple more good mana fixing options in Grand Coliseum, City of Brass. Trosan Verge is kind of a fun one that I recently added. You have creature lands, which help push back against the counterspells and also just give some points for the beatdown decks. Mishra's Factory, Fairy Conclave, Gitu Encampment, Treetop Village, all iconic, all classic cards there. I have Maze of Ith here. I don't think Maze of Ith is like super good, but it does highlight an aspect of the game that I wanted to have present here. They just don't make lands that don't tap for mana anymore, and they're weird the first time you see one. So I did want to maintain that discovery of, oh, here's something that they used to do. This is some part of the game, and figuring out how useful that is when you would want to play that sort of thing, I think is kind of fun. And then I have Wasteland and Port, once again reminding you that your lands are not necessarily safe. There's no reason to go all the way for Strip Mine, even though Strip Mine is a card that I used to play on the kitchen table a lot. Sorry, not sorry. But I went with the more balanced, more fun option here. I'm not saying getting wastelanded is the most fun gameplay experience, but it is the compromise position. And that's a lot of what's going on in this cube, is really finding the most fun way to highlight the way that things used to be. I think some people get really nostalgic for old Magic. Maybe you want to call it the good old days. I'm not on the other side of the fence. I don't think that these are the bad old days. But I do think that these old school, pre-modern, whatever environments do require a bit more care and curation than cubes that pull from wider card pools. There are, truthfully, a lot of things that give me pause about playing in this space, but I've spent a lot of time on this cube, and I've had a lot of fun playing it, and I've gotten it to a point where I feel like it's really replayable. I really enjoy the games and the decks that this cube generates. And if you're interested in this sort of thing, I hope that you give it a try. I hope that you enjoy it too. And that is going to do it for today's show. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you for taking the time to like, subscribe, comment, share, all that jazz. And we'll see you again next week talking more Cube. Later, gamers.